I'm going to tell you about how to better manage the nutrients in your soil to get optimum grass yields and good quality silage. I'm also going to be talking about managing your soil structure to avoid any long-term damage by compaction. I'm going to talk about lime recommendations and slurry. So first of all, it's really important to test your soil every 4 to 5 years. Typical soil sample works out at less than £2 an acre, or £2 a hectare, so it's really good value for money because you only have to do it every 4 to 5 years, and it can save you a lot of money on unnecessary fertiliser. So we sample our soil using a soil auger. We're sampling the top 7.5 centimetres of the soil, and this is where most of the grass roots are, and the soil test measures the amount of plant available nutrients within this zone. So it's really important to get a representative sample of your field. Fields are very variable in the soil properties across the field. So you need to take 30 good soil cores, a zigzag or W formation across the field. Keep away from any drinking troughs, hedges, ditches, gateways, anywhere where animals are resting. So you get about 30 cores per field, and these are into one bulk sample per field. So the soil test will measure phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, sulphur and soil pH. The recommended soil pH for continuous grassland is pH 6. Really important to maintain your grass at pH 6. A lot of the microorganisms in the soil that are involved in nutrient transformations and organic matter breakdown are really sensitive to soil pH. If you don't have your soil pH right, you're not going to get optimum yields. You could be losing as much as 2 tonne of dry matter a hectare per year if you don't have your soil pH correct. So traditionally we would have put on lime maybe only every 10 years or after reseeding, but research at AFBI has shown you're better off with a little and often approach to liming. So you're better less lime but more frequently, and try and maintain your pH 6 as close to 6 as you can. Now I'm going to talk about slurry. Okay, slurry is packed with nutrients. Try and make the most of your slurry nutrients. So the close period is 15th of October to 31st of January. During that time, that's when you take your soil test. And then go out with your slurry, sort of end of February, start of April. Try and get the nutrients into your soil for that first cut. Okay, to get the most of your slurry nutrients, try and keep the soil conditions as good as possible. So try not to go out if it's too wet, because you're more chance of losing nutrients into waterways. Also, if it's really hot and sunny with little wind, you're more chance of losing nitrogen to the atmosphere via ammonia volatilisation. So try and keep the conditions as good as possible. I know it's difficult. If it's really wet, you can go out with maybe an umbilical system, but try and keep the conditions good and prevent damage to your soil also. We recommend a low trajectory spreading method, such as a trailing shoe. This reduces the amount of nitrogen loss. It can increase your yields by 25%. Don't apply any more than 50 metres cubed per hectare of slurry or less than 5,000 gallons per acre. Nitrogen is one of your main nutrients. You need to try and manage your nitrogen as best you can. We have found that often second and third cut can be showing signs of nitrogen deficiency. So try and spread your nitrogen applications through the season so you're putting enough on for that second and third cut. Also potassium, it's also 15 to 20% of fields are deficient in potassium, but also you get a lot of fields which have too much potassium. Too much potassium or potash can cause magnesium deficiency, and this contributes to the development of grass tetany in grazing animals, particularly in the springtime. So you want your potassium on, your potash on, but you don't want to be putting on too much. So that's where your soil test comes in. It'll help you know how much you should be putting on. Phosphorus, so 50% of soils in Northern Ireland are overloaded with phosphorus. But also there are fields which are deficient in phosphorus. So the only way you know phosphorus requirement is from your soil test. You're better to try and get as much phosphorus as you can from slurry. So if you have fields which are high in phosphorus and other fields which are lower in phosphorus, we would recommend that you try and redistribute the slurry on your farm, put more in the lower phosphorus or low nutrient fields, and keep off those fields which are overloaded in nutrients. Finally, sulphur. A lot of fields in Northern Ireland are deficient in sulphur, especially at that first cut, April, May time. You also get deficiency at the second and third cut. You can lose as much as 30% of your yield if you're deficient in sulphur. And it's particularly sandy soils are more prone to sulphur deficiency, but it can also occur on clay soils. And you cannot get enough sulphur through slurry, so we recommend that you put on a sulphur containing fertiliser regularly. Finally, I'm going to talk about soil compaction. Okay, compaction is basically, it's just caused by repeated management. Okay, it occurs under machinery, also grazing animals. Okay, you want to try and reduce the amount of compaction. So soils are more vulnerable to compaction when the soil is wet. So that's why we tell you try and keep off the fields when they're wet. Also, try and reduce, new farm machinery can guide you along tracks. So it's repeated passes of the same tracks. That's where you get more vulnerability to compaction. So new farm machinery with GPS guided systems, that can help you avoid overlaps in your field. So compaction is basically a compression of the soil. So you're reducing the amount of oxygen in the soil. You're causing a pan to develop where the water can't drain through the soil. So that's going to affect your yields, it's going to affect your nutrient uptake by your grass. So you're trying to avoid that as much as you can. So signs of compaction would be if you have areas that are persistently lower yielding, you might suspect there could be compaction in those areas. Also, if there's water standing on the surface, you could maybe say that the water's not been able to drain through. So there are areas you can maybe suspect are compacted. So if it's surface compaction, you can go over and spike or slit the surface of the soil. If it's really severe compaction, which is what you want to avoid, you have to go in and subsoil and reseed. But that is a worst case scenario. You want to try and avoid getting it into that state because it's very expensive. So if you looked at your soil and thought it was maybe compact, you'd maybe see water standing on the surface, poor yields. If you dug a hole, this is really the only way you're going to see if the severity of the compaction. You might get a grey sort of layer. That means there's less oxygen in the soil there, sort of cloddy, sticky appearance. That's the kind of things you're going to look out for. Or mottles in the soil, like red or grey mottles, indicate lack of oxygen. So for compaction, it's better to try and avoid it as much as possible because it's very expensive to correct or remediate a soil that's very severely compacted. So if there's any questions?
A lot of the standard soil analysis comes back with a magnesium result.
Yeah.
Is that something that we need to worry about or consider? Or?
Well, our soils will be generally, if they're getting a lot of slurry, they'd be pretty high in magnesium. It wouldn't be that common to get low magnesium, but if you are in an area with low magnesium, dolomitic lime, maybe you could go on with that. But it does get a lot of magnesium with slurry. Now, if it's really, really high magnesium, excessive magnesium, it can start to affect the soil structure. So you don't want it getting overloaded magnesium, but it's always that careful balance because you need the magnesium for the animal health.
But if they are very high, is there anything?
There's not a lot you can do about it. Maybe keep off the slurry for a couple of years, but it depends on the other nutrients, and of course you have to put your slurry somewhere. I think it would be unusual to get so much magnesium that it's causing severe damage, but it is possible. Yeah.
You said there to aim for a pH of 6.
Yes.
Some people would say that's even too low. You need to be looking at 6.4 or 6.5. What's your views on that?
Well, the recommendation for grassland is pH 6. I don't really think you need to go higher than that. Obviously different crops require, but for grass it's pH 6. So I don't really think it's necessary to go above. I think you're not going to get any more yield benefit.
Is there any better time of the year to put lime on, or?
Well, we usually sort of say in the autumn or the springtime before, but you'd need to keep away from, if it's gone on in the spring, leave at least a month before you put your nitrogen, or there's, because if you put lime and nitrogen on, sometimes it can cause nitrogen loss. So You don't want it too close to your first nitrogen application.
Any risk of runoff then in the autumn time, with particularly heavy rain with applying lime?
Well, no, because lime, it doesn't run off as much. Lime is quite slow to break down in the soil, so the lime works over time. So if you put lime on, it can take several months before the pH actually gets up to the optimum, depending on how bad it is. So I don't think it's a problem so much of being lost. Yeah.
Would it be advisable to sow sulphur fertiliser after every cut?
Yes, you could do that, but I think you don't. I think the recommendation is no more than 30 kilograms per hectare sulphur per year. So as long as you're not putting on excessive amounts, and you can always get your grass tested. So if your grass is showing a need for sulphur, that can kind of indicate if you need to keep putting on second and third cut. Depends how low your sulphur is, but you could put it on at each cut. But I wouldn't, maybe not every year. Well, it's mainly for that first cut. It's important to get out with your sulphur.
Is gypsum any good?
Gypsum is good, yes. In place of lime, you mean?
Oh, well, for sulphur too, yeah.
Oh, sulphur, yes. But we kind of are thinking more of a nitrogen sulphur fertiliser. It's probably the most available form of sulphur.